Catherine of Habsburg, Queen of Portugal, lived surrounded by a level of luxury that other contemporary queens of hers could only aspire to. As the queen of a vast global empire and through her family connections, Catherine had privileged access to the most rare and exotic objects from all over the world, from precious stones from India to exotic animals from Africa. Catherine became one of the great collectors of the European Renaissance. But the lifestyle she lived and the objects she collected had a meaning beyond just her personal taste. Their existence also had a political and dynastic explanation, as they were part of Catherine's strategy to present herself as the mistress of a global maritime empire that spanned from Asia to South America. So on this video, I'm going to try to understand how did Catherine of Habsburg lived in the Portuguese court and what the collection she created can tell us about her and the world she lived in. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. Catherine of Habsburg, equally known as Catherine of Austria, was born in January of 1507 in Torquemada, a small township in the Kingdom of Castile. She was the last child of Philip of Habsburg, better known as Philip the Handsome, and Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad. For a queen famous for her opulence and luxury, Catherine, although she was a Spanish infanta and a member of the Habsburg family, had a very different childhood. Catherine grew up with her mother in virtual captivity in Tordesillas. The time she spent there was a tough one. Although Joanna's wardrobes were full of luxurious and precious objects, these were never used. Catherine had no other children to play with, and her chamber had no windows and only accessible through her mother's bedroom. Catherine was not allowed to go outside and dressed practically like a servant. But although they lived austere lives and Joanna's alleged mental health issues, she gave her daughter Catherine a good education. It's important not to forget that her mother spoke Latin and French perfectly. Joanna had a deep knowledge of music and played several instruments, like the clavichord and the vihuela, besides being an excellent dancer and one of the best Amazons of her time. Later in life, Catherine dominated these areas of knowledge and court skills, which serves as evidence that her mother instructed her the same way that Isabella the Catholic instructed Joanna and her sisters decades before. On November of 1517, Charles V and Eleanor of Habsburg, born and raised in Flanders, arrived in Tordesillas to visit their mother, Joanna, and their youngest sister, Catherine, that they have never met. Catherine, who was only 10 at this point, was described as gracious, attractive, and polite. From all her siblings, she is even said to be the one that resembled her father, Philip the Handsome, the most, especially when she smiled. Charles, probably impressed and displeased with the life conditions of his youngest sister, tried to take her away from that grim environment, not suitable for a princess. But Joanna had a very negative reaction to the possibility of being separated from her favorite daughter. But thanks to this, Catherine saw her life conditions improve. New clothes were made for her, and her chamber was improved with the opening of a window and the construction of a staircase to the exterior. She was given more freedom to circulate, and she even had a dog and a parrot. As a Habsburg princess, Catherine quickly became a pawn to serve her family's political interests as a potential bride to any one of its allies. In 1521, aiming to balance the new dynastic powers in the Iberian Peninsula, Charles V promised Catherine in marriage to the new king of Portugal, John III, while Charles V himself would marry John's sister, the Infanta Isabel of Portugal, in a double marriage with the Portuguese crown that maintained the centuries-old tradition of matrimonies between the royal houses of Iberia. In exchange for her rights to the Castilian crown, Charles gave 200,000 Castilian dollars for Catherine's dowry, a quantity that already included her jewelry, silver, and clothing. It's interesting to note that Charles ended up profiting from this double marriage much more than the Portuguese. Charles offered 200,000 Castilian dollars for his sister's dowry, but he received 900,000 Castilian dollars from Isabel's dowry. Charles V, although the lord of a vast empire, was constantly struggling with a lack of funds. To save money and time in the constitution of its sister's dowry and trousseau, he found in his mother's treasure the answer for his problem. Between 1519 and 1524, Joanna's collections were dilapidated, with Charles, but especially Catherine, choosing the best pieces for themselves. Their siblings were never informed and probably never knew of this authentic theft that deprived them from their mother's inheritance. The magnificent collection that Catherine later assembled in Lisbon had in its core the objects that she took from her mother's treasury, but this fact has to be read at the light of the practices of the late medieval and early modern period as well. For a princess of this period, her trousseau, which was the objects that her family provided her for her new life once she married, had a practical dimension and a symbolic meaning. The practical side was the fact that she would use these objects in her daily life in her new home. This could be furniture, textiles, jewelry and silver, clothes, books, liturgical implements, and all the other objects her household would need for everyday life. These belonged to her and her alone, and she had a right to maintain them in case of ever becoming a widow. The symbolic aspect was related to her cultural roots and her dynastic connections. These objects were supposed to, like the people who accompanied her to her new home, symbolize the place where she came from and the memories of her family, a visual reminder of her ancestry, as well as a symbol of wealth and prestige. Privately, they could also serve as a source of comfort for a young woman separated from her family forever. Throughout her life, but especially when she lived in Flanders with her husband, Joanna accumulated a fabulous treasury, famous for its tapestries, silverware, books, and jewelry. Some of these objects were inherited from her mother, Isabella the Catholic, and her mother-in-law, Mary of Burgundy, gifted by her husband or bought by Joanna herself. As such, besides their monetary value, they also had a symbolic one, serving as visual reminders of Catherine's ancestry, especially her Habsburg and Burgundian origins. An example of this is the cross of St. Andrew made with 5 large diamonds that originally belonged to Mary of Burgundy. Her son, Philip the Handsome, offered it to his wife Joanna as a New Year's gift in 1497. Catherine chose this jewel not only because St. Andrew was the patron of the Dukes of Burgundy, but because it created an immediate connection to her parents and her grandmother, Mary of Burgundy. Although her marriage with a Portuguese king was part of her brother's political strategies, Catherine was aware that she was given an excellent marriage that offered her an enviable position as the consort queen of an immense empire, and she always showed great gratitude for what he did for her. In the Portuguese court, Catherine manifested an authentic devotion to the figure of her brother, commissioning portraits of him and celebrating his victories as they were her own. The marriage of Catherine and John of Portugal was a great success. Harmony, respect, and affection characterized their relationship. He trusted her with state secrets, and she advised him in return. Close to the end of her life, and many years after the death of her husband, Catherine declared she was ready to join her bones to his for eternity, and how fortunate her life was by his side. John III and Catherine had similar tastes, and when they were different, they complemented each other. When it comes to their patronage of the arts, an activity deeply associated with royal might, their tastes were different. Catherine preferred to collect objects, and her collection, although varied, tended to lean towards the Flemish aesthetic as a result of her exposure to her mother's collections in Tordesillas. Her husband, on the other hand, preferred architecture, an art form traditionally patronized by royalty as a visual symbol of identity and propaganda. But his taste for architecture seems to go beyond that, being part of his personal interests. In fact, John III always displayed a strong enjoyment of architecture. Because his Latin wasn't particularly strong, he commissioned the translation of Vitruvius' Treatise of Architecture, and in 1547 he ordered the construction of a 2-meter-wide wood model of the Colosseum of Rome. Catherine's patronage of architecture is only significant in the last years of her life, when she commissioned and paid herself for the construction of a new main chapel in the monastery of Belém in Lisbon, founded by her father-in-law, King Manuel, as a symbol of the Portuguese expansion and a celebration of his own reign. But throughout her life, Catherine's attentions and financial efforts were concentrated on her precious collections. It's important to note that Catherine, as the Queen of Portugal, enjoyed economic and administrative autonomy from her husband. This is how she was able to finance her lifestyle and her collectionist endeavors. When she arrived in Portugal in 1525, it was established that she would receive 2 million Portuguese reais annually for her livelihood, with an extra pension of 66,666 reais annually. In 1529, after the death of her husband's aunt, the Dowager Queen Leonor of Portugal, she received the villages and cities that belonged to the house of the Queen, which added to her earnings an extra of more than 8.5 million reais annually. On top of that, Catherine also received a percentage of the products that arrived in Lisbon to be commercialized. pepper and spices from India, precious stones, amber, ivory tusks from Africa, sugar and fruits from Madeira, and wheat from Morocco. Until her death, she also received an annual shipment of silk from Granada, as established by her brother. All these products she used in her own house, and made an extra profit by selling the unused surplus. Besides being a queen, Catherine was also a shrewd businesswoman. The Portuguese court had many palaces in and around the city of Lisbon, the most important city in the kingdom and the hub of the Portuguese Empire. The most significant royal residence in the capital was the Ribeira Palace, built by King Manuel in the riverfront of the city, allowing him to be in the center of his domains. In the fall, the court usually moved to the Palace of Almeirim, unfortunately now lost, where hunting was the main activity. Sintra, facing the Atlantic, was chosen as a fresh refuge from the summer heat. But the royal family also had residence in other cities of the kingdom, like Tomar, Coimbra, and Évora. It's impossible to ignore that, although Lisbon was the center of his empire, John III had a particular affection for the city of Évora, where the court would spend long seasons. When Catherine arrived in Portugal, her collection was comprised by the objects that she chose from her mother's treasure and the gifts her brother and her husband gave her. It was already an impressive collection, full of elegant and luxurious objects. But over the next 5 decades, Catherine would enlarge this collection, adding precious rarities from all over the world. It's possible to note that her taste changed as well, becoming more refined and reflecting her fascination for India and the Orient, which resulted to her exposure to the lifestyle and culture of the Portuguese court. During the 16th century, due to their maritime expansion started in the previous century, the Portuguese were at the forefront of everything that was novelty, having contact with people and places that Europeans have never heard about before. Lisbon became a melting pot filled with people from all over the world, bringing new languages, new clothes, new types of food and new habits that ended up being mixed and absorbed by the Portuguese. This was an exciting moment, as well as a moment of change. The medieval period, slowly coming to an end, overlapped with the Renaissance, rapidly spreading through Europe. When Catherine arrived in Portugal, her collection can be classified as a medieval Schatzkammer, a religious or a church treasure composed primarily by precious stones and jewelry, tapestries, illuminated manuscripts and relics. The exotic side of her collection only became a reality after her marriage, which resulted in the creation of one of the first Kunstkammer of the Renaissance. Unfortunately, Catherine's collections are all gone, apart from a few rare objects that managed to survive, as we will see. But it's still possible to know its content and details through the inventories of her wardrobes, which were regularly made to help in the administration of the enormous collection. Like any other royal and aristocratic household, tapestries were the most important objects in Catherine's collections. Alongside jewelry, these luxurious textiles were the ones that had the highest monetary value. Textiles were the most important element of domestic interiors in the medieval and early modern periods, far more significant than furniture. Tapestries and other cloth drapings were used to decorate the interior of wealthy houses and palaces, bringing color, light, and comfort to otherwise large, cold, humid, and relatively unadorned spaces. Tapestries, for their price and craft, were considered superior to painting and sculpture, and a form of investment for the few who could afford them. They were appreciated for their mobile nature. They were easy to transport and quickly to transform any interior, even dividing one single space into more compartments if needed. This was particularly important for a time when royal and aristocratic courts were still far from being sedentary, traveling from place to place for different reasons. When Catherine traveled, her tapestries traveled with her in large leather pieces of luggage. Tapestries also had a symbolic dimension, as they were used as visual elements of power and wealth display, as well as elements of political and dynastic propaganda. The religious, historic, or mythological scenes represented in the panels could be used as metaphors to illustrate a specific reality associated with a person, a group, or an event. Many years before Catherine arrived in the court of Lisbon, her father-in-law, King Manuel, commissioned a monumental set of tapestries comprised of more than 20 large-sized panels known as the Cycle of the Conquest of India, to celebrate the Portuguese expansion. The tapestries, made with wool, silk, and gold thread, were exposed in the Great Hall of the Ribeira Palace and used for special festivities. When Catherine's daughter, Maria Manuela, wedded her cousin Philip of Spain in 1542, these tapestries were part of the scenery developed for the occasion. Catherine, like her Habsburg relatives, was a collector and a connoisseur of tapestries. She was familiarized with these items of luxury since her childhood in Tordesillas, where she first had contact with her mother's collections of Flemish tapestries. Interestingly, written sources inform us that, although these tapestries existed, they weren't used by Catherine and Joanna. Catherine's tapestry collection started relatively modest in numbers, but not in quality. 12 panels came from her mother's treasury in Tordesillas. Joanna was once the Countess of Flanders, granting her access to the best textile production of what was considered the biggest center of tapestry manufacture in Europe. With time, Catherine's collection grew exponentially, with the Queen buying and commissioning various sets of tapestries or isolated panels. All of these were carefully chosen by Catherine to fit in the image she projected of herself, queen of a vast empire and a Habsburg princess. But tapestries weren't the only luxury wall hangings present in her household. The importance given to textiles in domestic contexts were common to all of Europe, but it's impossible to ignore that the Portuguese had a particularly strong appetite for everything textile, a love that lasted far longer than in other parts of Europe. This was because of the ever-present influence that the Islamic civilization had in Portuguese and Iberian cultures, as well as the long-term contact that the Portuguese maintained with Asia. Foreign visitors to Portugal in the 16th century describe how the Portuguese removed their heavy wool tapestries in the summer, replacing them with guadamciche, engraved and colored panels made from leather, which allow them to create a cooler environment. Catherine had 54 guadamciche in tones of blue, silver, and gold imported from Spain. Other significant textile elements were carpets and cushions. These were particularly important to Portuguese culture as a result of the strong Islamic heritage present in Iberia. Foreigners described, sometimes with some astonishment, that the Portuguese, and especially Portuguese women, preferred to sit on cushions placed on top of a carpet instead of chairs. Portuguese documentation and iconography confirms this peculiar habit. Chairs existed and were obviously used, but their popularity only raised throughout the 16th century. Chairs were a symbol of power and authority, and because of this, they were always reserved to the most important people, like kings and princes. Domestically, women preferred to sit on cushions, a habit that still remained in the 19th century. Aristocratic women are often described as sitting on large silk cushions on top of a dais, a movable wooden platform the height of 1 step or more, covered with a carpet for warmth and comfort. When Empress Isabel married Charles V by proxy in the Palace of Almeirim, in the evening festivities that included dances and a play, Isabel, her brother John III, and her sister-in-law Catherine are described as seated on brocade cushions on top of a dais covered with a large carpet, all under a brocade canopy. Catherine liked to eat on cushions on top of a dais from a low table. She did the same for work, from administrative to domestic chores, like sewing. Catherine had a sewing kit with her all the time, complete with a pair of scissors made from gold with 2 rubies encrusted that she bought in India. One of the very few objects that survive from Catherine's collection is this Persian carpet, today kept in the National Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to import carpets from Iran like this one. This large carpet, made from silk, represents a garden scene with exotic animals and trees, typical of Islamic cultures. It was cut sometime in its history into several pieces, probably to fit a small space, but originally it measured 3 by 6 meters. A Persian carpet this size wasn't available on the market, which means that Catherine or someone for her specially commissioned it in the second half of the 16th century. In 1557, Catherine owned 82 carpets. 6 came from Turkey and 5 from Persia, the first ones to be exported to Europe. The following year she bought 17 Persian carpets made from wool, silk and gold. She was also the first European to collect Japanese tatami mats. Like tapestries, silverware had a high monetary value because of the quantity of precious metal invested in it. Catherine's collection started with the medieval silverware taken from her mother's wardrobes. She enlarged her collection by commissioning new pieces influenced by the Renaissance in Flanders and Castile. She also had some of her old pieces updated by João Cansado, the silversmith responsible for Holler's silver. Some of these objects were for her daily use, and others were destined to be exposed in tall sideboards on festive occasions, a common practice in royal and noble households since the Middle Ages, as a form of showing off wealth and impress visitors. Her servants used a fan made of solid silver with the face of a woman to keep the flames in her fireplaces alive, and in the rooms without them, silver braziers heated the environment, sometimes having perfumers on top to burn incense and fragrances. Catherine also had a large collection of cutlery, comprised of forks, spoons, and knives made from crystal, gold, and mother of pearl, some of them imported from the kingdom of Cote in Ceylon. Dining in the Portuguese court was an impressive affair. The kings generally ate separately and alone, which doesn't mean that they ate by themselves. Members of the royal family were never by themselves, they were always accompanied day and night. This means that while they were eating, the courtiers only served and watched standing up. Iberian courts observe a strong separation of men and women. Catherine's apartment was the feminine wing of the palace, and in Lisbon she even had a hall for herself, called the Hall of the Queen, as a parallel to the Great Hall of the Palace, used by the king and his men. She followed the Portuguese table service, which means that the queen was only surrounded and served by women. Male servers only carried the food until the door of the room where the queen was eating. From that point onwards, it was up to her ladies to serve her food and conduct the meal. Catherine's collection is particularly significant because it was the first European collection to have such a substantial quantity of non-European objects. For her table, Catherine bought 2 bowls of white and green jasper from Mughal India, a garnished coconut shell, and lacquered bowls, plates, and chests from China and Japan. A rare object surviving from Catherine's collection is this ivory fan, today housed in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. In 1542, the king of Kotte, in modern-day Sri Lanka, sent the first ever Asian embassy to an European court. This delicately carved ivory fan was a diplomatic gift offered to the queen by Siri Ramarashka Pandita, the ambassador of Kotte. Catherine imported great quantities of ivory objects, and fans like this were gifted by the Queen of Portugal to her Habsburg relatives. Other exotic and bizarre objects sometimes exposed by her table were what was believed to be the horn of a unicorn, which was probably the tusk of a narwhal, and 2 fossilized shark teeth, believed to be dragon teeth. Besides their curious and rare natures, these objects were also believed to have therapeutical and anti-poisoning capacities, which explain their proximity to her table. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish commercial routes to Japan, and Catherine adopted and popularized the use of articulated folding fans, a novelty in Europe, starting a trend that lasted for centuries. Catherine was one of the first European monarchs to collect Chinese porcelain, which was so rare and expensive that in this period, eating from plates of porcelain was considered superior from eating from plates of gold. Later in her life, Catherine also collected Ming Dynasty furniture, filling her apartments with chairs, decks, and tables of delicate lacquered Chinese furniture. Other objects meant to dazzle the visitors to her court were the small sculpture and salt cellars made from precious materials. In 1551, Catherine had a pair of Indian gods made from crystal with crowns, necklaces, and ankle bracelets made from gold and silver. This crystal rock salt cellar that belonged to Catherine is still preserved in Vienna. The elephant was made in Goa, and the queen had her jeweler, Francisco Lopes, add a medieval salt cellar to it in Lisbon. The queen had another one, now lost, in the shape of a crystal dog carrying a vessel in the shape of a Portuguese caravel. All these precious objects were kept in equally precious boxes made from mother of pearl, tortoise shell, and noble woods. Elephants and other exotic animals had a particularly strong significance to the Portuguese court. Decades before Catherine arrived in Portugal, her father-in-law, King Manuel, paraded in the streets of Lisbon with elephants, rhinoceros, leopards, and other foreign animals, unseen in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. This was a way for the King of Portugal to show off his power and opulence, using these animals as diplomatic gifts and visual emblems of his empire. Throughout Europe, kings and aristocrats wished to be sent one, satisfying their curiosity for these strange animals and allowing them to use them equally as political propaganda. Catherine followed the same strategy. She had colorful parrots and macaws from Brazil, monkeys from Africa, and elephants from India. The royal stables in Lisbon were an authentic zoo, where all the parts of the Portuguese Empire were represented. In 1555, Catherine sent her grandson, Charles of Spain, a zebra for him to play, the first zebra seen in Europe since antiquity. But the most famous animal offered by Catherine and her husband was an Indian elephant called Suleiman, a diplomatic gift to her nephews, Maximilian II and Maria of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperors. One of the ways that Catherine and her family had to keep a close proximity was through the exchange of portrait paintings. Although not exclusive, portraits were the only significant form of painting collected by Catherine. Portrait galleries were considered physical manifestation of family trees, and portrait paintings the visual exposition of the sitter's identity and family connections. It's by the use of portraits that the Habsburg family was able to transform their physical attributes, the famous Habsburg jaw and the thick lower lip, into symbols of family unit and ancestry. As such, Catherine's collection of family portraits was created in articulation with other Habsburg portrait galleries in Vienna, Madrid, and Brussels, establishing what was an authentic cult of family by the Habsburgs. In the spring of 1552, Catherine and other members of the Portuguese royal family posed for the artist Antonis Mor, the favorite portrait painter of the Imperial Court of Brussels, sent to Portugal by Catherine's sister, Mary of Hungary, to create updated portraits of the members of her Portuguese family. Catherine is portrayed as a distant, out-of-reach monarch. Nothing about this portrait is casual or by chance. With it, Catherine presented herself as the ruler of the vast Portuguese Empire and an illustrious member of the Habsburg family. Instead of a chair, Catherine is painted standing next to a table covered with green velvet, where it's possible to see a piece of paper. This is an allusion to her power and authority, as well as her ruling and administrative capacities. She is dressed with sumptuosity and covered with jewelry. Catherine chose a fashionable roupa, a loose-fit gown of Portuguese origins, embroidered with gold and made in black velvet, a color deeply associated with the Habsburg family. She holds a velvet Indian fan, a symbol of the Portuguese Empire, on her left hand, and a handkerchief and a pair of leather gloves on her right hand, as a symbol of court refinement. Her choice of jewelry is a deliberate identity strategy. Catherine's belt, made from gold and pearls with precious stones, has a buckle in the shape of a double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, a clear reference to her family. But even more interestingly, this belt was a wedding gift her husband John III gave her before they even met, decades before she posed for this portrait, which can also be interpreted as a discreet sign of affection for her husband. The same interpretation can be taken from her necklace. The piece Catherine is wearing was baptized the Collar de las Rosas, the necklace of the roses, which once belonged to her mother, Joana. Catherine brought it with her from Tordesillas and decided to wear it as a family heirloom, as a direct reference to her mother and her Spanish grandparents, the Catholic kings. Her earrings are a sign of her own personal identity, each pair with 3 pearls hanging from 2 intertwining C's, the initials of her name. Catherine was so pleased with the result that from that moment onwards until her death in 1578, all the portraits and effigies of Catherine were made after this portrait, which ended up being the definitive image of the Queen. This is how Catherine wished to be seen and reminded, as a powerful, opulent, and dominant ruler. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.